And then you get to Paul, and because again, what does cross-bearing look like? What does it mean in an affluent, largely Christocentric culture, or at least a culture that has the vestiges and the residue of Christianity everywhere? What does that look like? How do we invent fake reasons to act like we're martyrs? Like, I didn't get that promotion at work, and then sue the company? No, that is very, very American, but it's not very Christian. You get to 1 Corinthians 9, and Paul talks about foregoing his rights for the sake of love. Okay? Paul talks about the fact that as an apostle, as a special envoy, as an ambassador, as an anointed representative of Jesus Christ. All right, this is how Paul understood himself. I have certain rights, and he lists them. I have a right to charge money for my ministry, because he who preaches the gospel should live from the gospel, right? A laborer is worthy of his hire. A laborer is worthy of his wages, Paul says. So I have every right to not work, but to do my work as an apostle and charge money for that and live that way. But I don't do it. But I could. Other apostles do it. I don't do it. I have a right to be married. He even talks about Peter, and I think Barnabas too. We read in the Gospels that Jesus heals Peter's mother-in-law, and so clearly Peter has a wife. And so Paul says, I as an apostle have a right to take a wife, to marry. But I am not going to do it. I'm not going to do it because it might be a stumbling block or an impediment to your faith for some reason. And the final one, which is probably the biggest of all, is the dietary restrictions that the Mosaic covenant placed upon Israel. You can't eat certain kinds of food. You can't, blend certain kinds of fabrics and all of this. And Paul says, because I'm not under the law anymore, because I am not under the Mosaic regime, I have the freedom to eat whatever I want. I can eat pork. I can eat shellfish. I can eat meat from an animal with a cloven hoof, right? All these things that were prohibited under Moses. Paul says, I can eat anything I want. I am not under that. I'm not bound by those legalistic demands. No one is. However, I recognize that in so doing, in exercising my freedom, I could easily be a stumbling block, perhaps to Jewish people who were intrigued by this Jesus and this gospel message of the new covenant. And yet they're still under Moses, and they're still under that yoke of bondage. And so for them to see someone flaunt his freedom, someone who was a well-regarded rabbi and teacher of Israel, Saul of Tarsus, to see someone of that stature flaunting his newfound freedom and just eating pork chops and, sausages and pepperoni pizza and all this, Paul recognized, because of the love that he has for his kinsmen according to the flesh, as he calls them, that could very well wound their faith, because they're interested and they're open. I don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. And so the three issues, money, marriage, and meat, issues that Paul as an apostle had every right to exercise his rights, okay? But because of his love for his kinsmen according to the flesh, and because of his love for all people, he willingly chose to forego the exercise of his rights because of his love for people, okay? This is something unique. This is something profound, in fact, because Paul says, we often hear, especially Calvinists, say things like, well, you can't boast. You're not allowed to boast. Boasting is bad, right? Boasting in something you've done is bad. But Paul didn't think so. Paul very much desired to boast, but he couldn't boast in things he was commanded to do. He couldn't fulfill a command and then boast about it. So that's why Paul says in 1 Corinthians 9, I believe, I preach the gospel, but I can't boast about that because necessity is laid upon me. Indeed, woe is me if I preach not the gospel. Okay? So Paul is saying, the fact that I'm preaching the gospel is not something I can brag about because I've been explicitly commanded to do it. I've been anointed, ordained, commissioned, and sent forth to preach this gospel by the risen Christ, whom Paul would say he saw in a vision on the road to Damascus. So the principle is simple. You cannot boast in obeying an explicit command because that's just what you're supposed to do, right? It reminds me of that old Chris Rock bit. I'm not going to go into too much detail because I'll get canceled. But he has a whole bit where he mocks the idea prominent among some in his community of bragging about stuff that you're supposed to do. Like, I ain't never been to jail. I take care of my kids. And his point is, you're supposed to do that, and you're not supposed to go to jail. You don't get to brag about stuff that you're supposed to do, right? But it's when you go above and beyond. And this is Paul's point. When you go above and beyond and say, I'm not going to boast in doing what is required of me because that's not how it works. However, if I choose to do it for free and I work as a laborer on the side in order to pay my own bills so that I don't have to charge money for my ministry, I can boast in that. And Paul does boast in that. If I do it unencumbered by a wife, even though I have every right, like some of the other apostles, to marry and to have a divided attention. Because if you're married, you can't just be focused on your work or your ministry. You also have to take care of your family. Paul says, I have every right to divide my attention from the gospel and marry a wife and be a family man who also exercises his ministry. But I've chosen to forego that right. I've forfeited that right to marry. I can boast about that because that's not just doing what I'm told. It's going above and beyond, right? It's what Jesus meant in the Sermon on the Mount. You ever heard the phrase, go the extra mile, right? That's what that comes from Jesus. He says, if someone asks you to go with a mile with them, like a Roman soldier in those days in the Roman Empire could compel just a random person. Hey, I'm headed that way. I have all this stuff. I want you to carry some of my burden for me. And when I get there, I'll take my stuff back. So basically, I'm going to use you as like a pack mule. And Jesus says, if someone compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. If someone asks you for your coat, give them your tunic also, right? If someone asks you for some sort of help, go above and beyond. Go the extra mile. So Paul is saying, I can't boast in preaching. I can't boast in my ministry. I can boast in doing it for free. I can boast in doing it as a single celibate person who chooses not to marry, even though I have every right to, and even though other apostles have gotten married, and I'm going to willingly curtail what I eat. Even though I am free from these Mosaic, burdensome dietary restrictions, I am going to curtail my diet and actually change what I eat so as not to stumble a weaker brother, right? The point is that love should cause you to willingly forgo your rights, okay? And so when it comes to cross-bearing, when it comes to what it means to live a virtuous life under the new covenant, when it comes to this idea that we can avoid the void and just find, even by legal means and lawfare, the path of least resistance, right? Which is what we are told in our self-help section at the bookstore, in most Christian churches, everywhere you go. You can choose the path of least resistance. You have rights. You should exercise them. If anyone ever tries to curtail your rights or deny you your rights, you can sue them, right? Paul says, no, I will willingly forego my rights out of love for the other. This is what it means to live a life of cross-bearing. We don't live in an age of persecution. Who knows? Maybe one day we will. And I know that a lot of Christians act like they desperately want to be persecuted so they can go on TikTok and cry and get likes and clicks, right? But the fact is that we do not live in that kind of world. We live in a world of privilege, especially if you're a Christian. You get all kinds of special privileges, even though you don't believe it, it's true. But we live in a world as though if privileges are taken away, we call that persecution, right? Because And I understand the reason why people have this sort of martyr complex and this victim mentality. It's that I want to be faithful, and Jesus promised me that I'll be persecuted, so maybe this is what persecution is, me not getting that promotion, or Starbucks putting happy holidays on the cup instead of Merry Christmas. Maybe that's persecution, you know? But no, the way that we're supposed to make sense, and no one's going to like this because it's very un-American, but the way we're supposed to make sense out of these promises of persecution and hardship and trial and suffering and tribulation, the way we make sense out of it is the way Paul did in 1 Corinthians 9. Paul is saying, maybe one day I'll be persecuted by the state, and he was, at least if tradition is to be believed. But I don't have to wait around for something like that to happen to me. In other words, I don't have to wait around until some Roman centurion places a cross on my back to bear my cross. I don't have to wait for that to happen. I don't have to be some passive person waiting around to get in trouble for my faith. But instead, I can willingly go above and beyond and curtail, forego, forfeit my own rights for the sake of love for the other.